In November of 2008, I had a profound personal experience. I was down to 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. Soon thereafter, I came back to this world. It doesn't matter if you want to call that force God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, but fact of the matter is it's a very real force. The scientific evidence proving the reality of the afterlife is beyond dispute already. Remote viewing has been scientifically demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. Precognition is real. These are forms of non-local consciousness. Coincidences, synchronicities, these are very powerful concepts that defy materialist causal explanations, and yet they're real.
Welcome to Dreams and Fortune. I am excited to be joined here today with Dr. Eben Alexander. He is a neurosurgeon, a near-death experience survivor, and the best-selling author of Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journal into the afterlife, Living in a Mindful Universe, and several other books. Dr. Alexander, how are you doing today?
Tim, I'm doing great, and it's great to be talking with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm familiar with your story, but for anybody that is not yet familiar, what happened in 2008, and how would you say that this experience changed your understanding of life and consciousness?
Well, I'll have to point out who I was before. 54-year-old academic neurosurgeon working at Harvard trying to teach neurosurgery, thought I understood something about brain, mind, and consciousness, but like most of us in modern science, I was trained in kind of the conventional viewpoints of materialism or physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists. That's the stuff we can measure, and therefore things like thoughts, beliefs, attitudes have no basis in reality. And then in November of 2008, all of that changed completely because I had a profound personal experience. It came in the form of a severe case of what's known as gram-negative bacterial meningitis. That's worst kind of meningitis you can have. It was actually meningoencephalitis because my brain was very attacked by this infection. And I spent 1 week in coma. My doctors estimated I started that week with about a 10% chance of survival, but by the end of the week I was down to 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And that's why the doctors recommended taking me off the ventilator, off the antibiotics, and just letting me go. Soon thereafter, I came back to this world, but when I did, my brain appeared wrecked to my family and to my doctors, and I spent 36 hours in and out of a paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare after they'd extubated me, after I emerged from coma. But then things started to level out. And the interesting thing was all I knew was when I woke up in that ICU room was where I'd been. That incredible journey that occurred during the week of coma seemed like months or years, was an extraordinary kind of journey. And the interesting thing was it had an atypical feature for near-death experiences, and that is amnesia. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, none of my earthly knowledge, no knowledge of humans, this universe. It was an empty slate, and only in the weeks and months after coma did it become clear to me why that empty slate was so crucial for some of the deepest lessons I was to receive from this whole experience. Now, I won't go into detail about the spiritual aspects of the experience. That's all covered in the books Proof of Heaven and in the hundreds of talks I've given online, YouTube, etc. But I will simply say that I had a profound spiritual experience involving a journey through multiple layers of primitive starting layer that I call the earth or my view, and then this beautiful, rich, kind of earthly yet spiritual layer of intersection that I call the Gateway Valley. And that's where I met my guardian angel, this beautiful spiritual guide, lovely young woman who kind of guided me through this entire journey. Interesting to point out that she was someone I didn't know, because when I started reading the NDE literature after this, I was shocked that my guardian angel was somebody I did not know. But of course, people who've read the story will realize that has a lot to do with my adoption history. The fact that I was put up for adoption when I was 11 days old, but wasn't adopted out till age 4 weeks because my birth mother wouldn't sign the papers. Anyway, my whole life, that adoption abandonment wound had been associated with a subconscious kind of doubt as to whether or not I was even worthy of love or existence. And all of that came to a very strongly affirmative answer in my NDE, And a lot of that also included the beautiful spiritual guide, whose identity I didn't discover until 4 months after my coma. And once I recognized that and realized that it all seemed way too real to be real because it really happened, just not in the material realm, that's when I had to start taking all of this very seriously. And so we can get into some of that, about some of the aspects of NDEs that are absolutely shocking and really demand our attention. But once we start to accept this much bigger role, everything starts to fall into place and make much more sense. I've spent the 17 years since my coma that occurred when I was 54 years old. I've spent those 17 years working with other experiencers, giving hundreds of talks and presentations, many at scientific conferences, and working with other scientists and experiencers trying to come up with a world model, a world view that actually works to assimilate all this and be consistent with modern science. And that's really what our third book is all about, Living in a Mindful Universe. It came out in 2017. That was written with my wife, and co-author of that book was Karen Newell. She's also the co-founder of a company called Sacred Acoustics that makes binaural beat brainwave entrainment, and I'm a big fan of Sacred Acoustics. I use them an hour or two a day and have been for the last 12 or 13 years. Meditation has been incredibly important to me in terms of coming to a deeper understanding of my NDE. But the reality is it was all an extraordinary experience involving these multiple layers of kind of a spiritual realm, kind of a very complex story, and yet in many ways a very simple story. Because in the core realm, the kind of deepest I went, it was clear that my very conscious awareness was sourced in that God force, and I came back realizing, it doesn't matter if you want to call that force God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, all the words we've attached to that kind of benevolent wisdom of the universe. But the fact of the matter is it's a very real force. More than 90% of near-death experiencers, many of whom were previously agnostic or atheist, come back to this world believing in the reality of that force. They've experienced it. So it should be very reassuring to humans at large. And it's because it suggests to us eternity of soul and our connection with the meaning and purpose of the universe. So with that kind of humble beginning, I'd like to jump into any kind of questions or directions you'd like to take.
Thank you so much. And your story is so fascinating and inspirational. And you mentioned some near-death experience survivors who, previously were atheist or agnostic. And so you came from a scientific background, skeptics who believe that near-death experience survivors are simply brain-based hallucinations. As a former neurosurgeon, what would you say to someone that is?
I would say, first of all, the scientific evidence proving the reality of the afterlife is beyond dispute already. I'll give your listeners a website where they can find 29 essays, bigelowinstitute.org. You'll find 29 essays written 4 years ago, all from scientists who demonstrated at least 5 years of research experience studying the afterlife question. And the man who gave the awards away, Robert Bigelow, was interested because his wife had passed, his son had committed suicide. He wanted to know, is there any scientific evidence that their souls are still around? And held this essay contest, originally planning to give away 3 monetary awards, ended up giving out 29. So if you start at bigelowinstitute.org, you will realize that we're already far beyond whether or not this is valid and real from a scientific standpoint. It is. And I'll tell you that, for example, a lot of this information that supports the same arguments is in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And in that book, the principle of consilience, that is the notion that if you look at a deep problem, and this, it would be the nature of consciousness, and if you look at it from several different angles, and they all tell you the same thing, pay big attention. And so in this discussion, that consilience originates with the hard problem of consciousness and neuroscience, which is actually an impossible problem for materialism. And David Chalmers brought up that challenge of the hard problem of consciousness back in the mid-1990s in a book called The Conscious Mind. That's the beginning of it. So he suggests that consciousness is something more fundamental in the universe. You also have philosophy of mind, the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness within any individual mind, which is everything that I see, hear, body sense of presence and awareness, body position, my surrounds, other beings that might be around me, memories of past events, executive function of future events, etc. All of that is one ball of consciousness. It's not like different neuronal populations contributing their little 2 bits to this consciousness. So the binding problem is a big issue for materialist thought. Also in consilience, the argument of parapsychology, non-local consciousness. For example, telepathy. Guillaume Playfair wrote a beautiful book called Twin Telepathy, in which he states that 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. One twin can touch a hot stove. The other twin, 1,000 miles away, might feel pain and develop a blister. Now, once you realize that these twin experiences are quite real, you also realize that telepathy occurs in addition to twins. For example, the day I went into coma, I had met my birth family a year before my coma. And we'd had a lot of time together, family reunions, etc. But then we'd spent 3 or 4 months not communicating. And after 3 or 4 months of no communication, my birth mother came home from a business trip. She was a realtor. And realized something was badly wrong with me. She had to reach out. She knew in her mind I was in trouble. She called the family, found out I'd gone into coma that day, had meningitis, might not be living through it. So that form of telepathy between a mother and child, even if they spent the first 54 years of their life apart. Also remote viewing. Remote viewing has been scientifically demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, of course, Wikipedia says remote viewing is pseudoscience, but that's because I would say Wikipedia is a pseudo-encyclopedia. Anybody on Earth can edit it, and you have all these biased positions coming in and claiming their territory, and they're very materialistic at Wikipedia. So anything remotely spiritual is squashed as quickly as they can squash it. So, but anyway, getting back to the facts about remote viewing, Jessica Utz, the head of the American Statistical Association, gave a presidential address in 2015 where she said that the p-value for all of these remote viewing experiments to be untrue, just the result of chance, is something like 1 in 10 to the minus 23rd. I forgot the exact number, but it's some astronomical figure that Jessica Utz said remote viewing is real. Precognition is real. That is, in experiments where we assess people's ability to know a few seconds later what image is going to come up on a computer screen. People have a way of knowing that, and I think they're actually creating that truth more than just reading the future. But anyway, these are forms of non-local consciousness. And one of the biggest, in addition to near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death, but happen in perfectly healthy people, usually a bystander soul that's either a healthcare worker or another loved one, and they can be at a great distance from the person who's dying. And then you even have shared crossings where people, William Peters in California is working on the Shared Crossing Project to help people have shared death experiences with loved ones. But beyond all of this information of consilience supporting the primacy of consciousness, you have a tremendous body of literature supporting the reality of reincarnation. Now, most of us say, well, I don't remember past lives, so there's no such thing as reincarnation. But when you study these scientifically, these claims of past life memories in children, the UVA, University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, uvadops.org, basically has been studying these for about 60 years or so. And of the 2,500 cases plus that they've studied, more than 1,700 they've solved. And the solving it means they found the person who lived before that fits this definition, the mode of death, the names, the various acquaintances and family members, etc. These kids remember all that from their past life. And but then the interesting thing is those memories fade by age 6 or 7. And especially when associated with a well-known process, it's called the amnesia of childhood, where most of us don't remember many things before age 5 or 6 or 7. And combine that with the fact that that's where those memories live of past lives and between lives. And then those kids, even the ones who are heavily written about, like the child in Soul Survivor, S-O-U-L Survivor by Bruce and Andrea Leininger, who also wrote one of those winning Bigelow papers. That child, by age 7 or 8, he had no more memory of that. He was now into this life, and that I think is the reason, gives us skin in the game that we don't necessarily remember those past life and between life memories into this lifetime as we grow into adults. So anyway, all of this information together in this consilience argument makes it very clear that consciousness is primordial in the universe, that we're really sharing that one mind, that God mind. And we each get a little eddy current of that God mind consciousness that we see as kind of our own consciousness and we think is private. But again, as we pointed out, remote viewing, telepathy, all these shared death, near death, similar experiences show an overlap of consciousness that's very difficult to explain from a materialist viewpoint. But when we look at consciousness as primary and see the brain as a filter or transceiver, that allows us to experience our little piece of that primordial mind, that's where it all starts to make much more sense. And this is where the science is headed. We'll never go back to the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends when your brain and body die, your conscious awareness comes to an end, because that's not true. We're all eternal souls in this beautiful game of life, and we come back again and again, all towards that same process of coming towards oneness with the divine, love, kindness, compassion for our fellows. The deepest lesson of NDEs is treating others with respect and dignity, because to hurt another is to hurt ourselves. So this message from NDEs is kind of the tip of the spear in this modern understanding of the science of consciousness, leads us towards a world where we show much greater kindness, respect, mercy, acceptance, help our fellow beings, take care of the least, the last, and the lost. I mean, it's a complete shift from the kind of naked narcissism and egocentrism that you see running rampant in our modern world. That's not who we are as spiritual beings. That's the ego gone berserk. And what we're talking about here is higher soul and a more responsible, mature form of self beginning to govern the way that we live in this world.
That is really, I mean, that's a lot. That is very fascinating, extremely fascinating. You mentioned the word filter. Our brain is a filter. So how exactly is that if there's source where everything comes from, consciousness, and our brain is a filter? Are we still creating through our brain, or can you clarify the filter just a little bit?
Well, I would say that there are several mechanisms that are part of the brain as this filter. They begin in the lower brainstem, at some of the circuits that are most responsible for kind of alerting and awakening. In fact, with sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment, you're actually using those ancient circuits, specifically the superior olivarian nucleus in the medulla, down in the lower brainstem. And you're causing this powerful oscillation back and forth at that level. Now, we're all familiar with oscillations in the brainstem inducing hypnotic states, EMDR, for example, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, very effective treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, utilizes these powerful oscillations. Now, for hypnosis and EMDR, they're using the midbrain. And what sound of sacred acoustics and binaural beat brainwave entrainment do is go into an even more primitive and therefore more powerful level of the brain to help kind of shake consciousness loose from this illusion of here, now, and sense of self, which is what our waking brain is involved in, is kind of interacting with this body, running the body, etc. And yet we can get into a hypnagogic state. That means between awake and asleep, a state of lucid dreaming. That's what these binaural beats of sacred acoustics are so powerful at doing. And then also there are other structures as we ascend up through the brain that are responsible for this filtering mechanism. I would say the claustrum is part of it. Certainly in humans, our language cortex in both frontal and temporal lobes is involved in some of this engagement with the material world, but also by letting go of that kind of voice in the head, we're able to get to a much deeper level of conscious awareness, which we've described a lot in our meditation workshops and things like that using sacred acoustics. People can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn more. Also, we talk about this quite a bit in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. In addition, there is a free workbook that's online that goes with that Living in a Mindful Universe. That workbook is available to anybody, everybody for free. And that's at ebenalexander.com. And right at the entry page there, your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. And you leave a first name and email address, and you're off and running. You've got 33 days of each day getting an email with one of the main concepts from that book. More than 17,000 people have taken that course to date. Many of them leave their comments and help each other. So it's a community. So join up with that 33-day journey and you'll be off and running to start getting into some of the power of this and how the brain works as a filter or transceiver. This idea of filter theory is not a new theory. It was originally developed William James, who was the head of psychology at Harvard, the head of American psychology in the late 1800s, talked about filter theory. They called it the brain a reducing valve. They were basically using the technology of the day, a steam engine, and the brain is compared to the technology of the day. So they said a reducing valve is kind of it. It reduces that primordial God mind down into this limited form that's our human mind, but that ultimately the consciousness itself is not created by the brain. Then there are many others working in that era, F.C.S. Schiller, Frederick W.H. Meyer, and then later Aldous Huxley, who wrote Doors of Perception about his experiences on mescaline, where he also came to see the brain as simply a filter for the kind of spiritual wisdom of the universe, that spiritual mind. So filter theory is something that's been around for a long time, and it's regaining tremendously in the modern era as many brain scientists, neuroscientists, philosophers of mind, physicists, quantum physicists, etc., are coming to realize the connection between quantum physics and consciousness is absolutely real. That was kind of the next element I didn't have time to go into minutes ago in discussing this consilience argument. But one of the biggest pieces, in addition to the hard problem in neuroscience and the non-local consciousness and parapsychology, is quantum physics itself. And many of the founding fathers of quantum physics, Erwin Schrödinger, Max Planck, Pascual Jordan, and others, they made statements of indicating that when we investigate the subatomic world, what we find is, interestingly enough, all those particles we're investigating, their behavior depends heavily on our mind and our decisions about how to observe them. And in fact, that relation between mind is so strong that John Archibald Wheeler, who's head of physics at Princeton, he was also involved in the Manhattan Project, Wheeler came up with what he called the participatory anthropic principle. And he did that in a setting where he was discussing what's called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, a very complex experiment that involves erasing quantum data in these particles as they fly through the measuring apparatus. And what he realized is the photons behave as if they're conscious of whether or not they're being observed. It's really kind of astonishing. That's the simplest way to put it. But the bottom line is Wheeler came up with a participatory anthropic principle to indicate that all of physics is operating with a participation of the mind of human investigators. And we can't move ourselves out of it to just say it's all just material stuff following the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. But in fact, there's a deeper layer of mind over matter. And this is especially crucial, in quantum physics and a deeper understanding of what it's telling us. I'd say, in fact, the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022 for Entanglement was the scientific community officially, that is the Nobel Committee, finally admitting that four-dimensional space-time is no longer the limiting theater of physics and kind of the operation of our understanding. But because of the mental field that is what I would call this entanglement field, what we're finding there is we're all entangled. And I think entanglement is going to be absolutely critical to even understanding how time flows, because consciousness is deeply involved with our kind of understanding of time flow and our experience of time flow, and yet we know time flow itself is not part of that fundamental underlying reality. So all of this just paints a much bigger picture of the primacy of consciousness. And near-death experiences in many ways are the kind of tip of the spear for helping the modern scientific community unravel that deep mystery of consciousness and the brain-mind connection. The entanglement field is clearly the end of what's called local realism. That's what bothered Einstein so much. In 1935, he and Podolsky and Rosen wrote a paper saying quantum physics had to be incomplete. They did not think it could be a complete theory, especially because of entanglement, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. And then 30 years after that paper, John Bell, who was an Irish physicist, came up with an actual mechanism for doing experiments to decide whether Einstein was right with hidden variables or was quantum physics true, spooky action in a distance entanglement. And the first person to do one of those experiments was one of the three winners of that prize in 2022. That was John Clauser. And his experiments were done, I think, in the early 80s. And to his surprise and John Bell's surprise, they discovered Einstein was wrong. Spooky action in a distance seemed to be real. But all the physicists say, no, can't be, can't be. There's got to be a loophole. So they came up with many different loopholes. And then other physicists would do experiments that would expand beyond the loopholes. And the second winner was Alain Aspect. He was from France, an optical physicist who was very good at fast switching operations so that even as the photon is flying through these devices to measure entanglement, they can change the parameters. So try and fool the photon. It didn't work. So again, they show spooky action at a distance is real. Finally, Anton Zeilinger from Austria came up with experiments on a tremendous cosmic scale. For example, using light from stars hundreds of light years apart in the sky, who had never communicated, with that information. And yet, by using that to set the parameters in the machine, he proved that entanglement was absolutely real. Spooky action at a distance, which means local realism is dead. That's what Einstein was defending. Local realism. Local means all physics is local. Particles interact by touching each other. Like when I look at a distant star, it's the photon coming from the star touching the retina in my eye. That's what allows the information to be transferred. It always involves particles touching other particles. And the speed limit for those particles, non-photons, is the speed of light. They cannot go that fast, or all the fermions, quarks and electrons, etc. They can never achieve light speed. So the ultimate information speed limit for the universe is speed of light, and yet entanglement in some ways seems to violate that. And even though right now, in general, quantum physicists will tell you we can't use entanglement for information transfer, but the information is able to do that. The connection between these particles seems instantaneous. So there's something going on there that we don't quite understand yet, but it clearly shows the information can be passed instantaneously across the universe between these particles that seem to be connected at their origin. And I would say ultimately we'll be finding that entanglement includes all of this universe and dictates time flow and information flow in ways that are far deeper than anything limited by four-dimensional space-time and special relativity.
Wow, my mind is really blown here. I want to back up just real quick because you did mention time, space, and not being how we perceive it from past to present to future. And so with that, it's common for many people to have intuitive hunches, or you think about somebody and then they send you a text message, or they pop up in your life all of a sudden. Or for myself, I've had many dreams about things in that sort of state, and then it happens in real life or as it's happening. And so is this type of thing with intuition or even remote viewing, and of course near-death experiences, but is this all a glimpse of the same source? How is this?
Absolutely. Beautifully put. And by the way, I've got to finish one little piece of that local realism discussion. I talked about the local, that the particles have to touch. The other part is realism, and that's the notion that an objective physical world exists out there independently of our measurements. And with quantum physics, you can actually demonstrate that the knowledge is the beginning of the existence of those particles. As John Wheeler put it, to be is to be perceived. And so Wheeler was claiming he was in agreement with the idealist George Berkeley, who had lived 200 years earlier. And so very important that local realism is no longer valid. That's what entanglement refutes completely. But getting to your question, yes, absolutely brilliant. This is about our connection with information, with the soul, with purpose in life, coincidences, synchronicities. These are very powerful concepts that defy materialist causal, explanations, and yet they're real. I would refer people to recent books by Bernard Beitman on meaningful coincidences. Also, Sharon Hewlett Rawlett. It's called The Source and Significance of Coincidences, Hard Look at Astonishing Evidence. So both those books um, by her and by Bernard Beitman are all about meaningful coincidences, synchronicities. Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychoanalyst, is the one who really kind of put a big focus on synchronicities as important in kind of the human psyche. And they're very important because they also demonstrate a level of connection we have with reality that goes very deep and resist the simplistic explanations of materialist causality. And that's why I think that this kind of focus on synchronicities and coincidences is so important. It basically is like a nudge wink from the universe that allows us to pay much more attention to this deeper reality, and also has to do with our ability to influence that reality. This is where appeal to things like the power of prayer, and there I would refer people to books by my good friend Dr. Larry Dossey. He wrote Healing Words and Be Careful What You Pray For. I highly recommend his books. Very much tuned in. By the way, he was an identical twin, and there was a lot of telepathy in his world. So he also wrote a book called One Mind, which I highly recommend. I think One Mind, our book Living in a Mindful Universe, and Steve Taylor's book Spiritual Science together make a very compelling case for the primacy of mind and how all of our brains of animals, humans, etc., are just filters that allow that one mind to express itself. But interestingly, the concept is really one of free will. So, in other words, this is not just about a lot of predetermined stuff, but the fact that our souls interact with other souls, and that's how we generate our emerging reality. That's why things like life reviews in near death experiences are so important to get. Life reviews are not just a vague memory or dream about life, but they're often a reliving of very real events in life. And about a third of life reviews, and they occur in about half of all NDEs, but about a third of those life reviews say that their entire life is involved. And you might wonder, how does that happen during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? Well, it's because in that realm, you're completely timeless. And that's why meditation and centering prayer can be valuable tools of getting us there, because they also put us into that timeless realm and allow us to experience and develop relationships with that primordial mind through deep meditation and centering prayer. So all of these things show kind of the beauty of our existence as souls with free will influencing our emerging reality and paying attention to those nudge winks of the universe. I mean, I've had several very powerful synchronicities of my own, some very kind of short-lived, but wow, some involving my whole life over time scales of 10 and 20 years, where all of a sudden it made sense to me why certain events that were very mysterious at the time they occurred, bam, all of a sudden they unfold making perfect sense because they're deeply involved with the kind of purpose and meaning of my existence. So awakening to these bigger truths about ourselves helps us to mature into the souls we truly came here to be.
And how do you suggest for anyone watching or listening to this today, how can we awaken into this greater truth?
Well, I think the main thing I'd recommend is take some time out each day for meditation or centering prayer. If you already have a very useful, powerful technique, to point out what I think should be obvious is to meditate or effective prayer, I would say ultimately involves putting the ego voice into timeout. The voice in our head is not our higher soul, it's not our consciousness. That voice in the head, in many ways, I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in the head the annoying roommate. And that's a very good way to look at it. For me, meditation, that annoying roommate, the ego voice of Eben Alexander, that lives right here in my left temporal and frontal lobes, that voice can make a request, state a question, what have you. But then I've learned to ride the tones of sacred acoustics and that oscillation in the lower brainstem to quiet that voice. That voice goes into timeout. And basically, I'm able to get into a hypnagogic state. That is the same kind of state we're in between awake and asleep. But it's not a state where your little, ego voice is sitting there going, oh, you're doing this all wrong. How come you can't meditate? Blah, blah, blah. All that. That voice is in timeout now because you can meditate. And that little ego voice needs to be kind of omitted. And that's exactly what you're doing in this process of meditation. That's why, for example, sacred acoustics is a very powerful tool. It uses differential frequency brainwave entrainment. That was a phenomenon first described by a Prussian physicist, Wilhelm Heinrich Dove, back in the late 1800s. He knew that if you put a pure tone in one ear and a slightly different tone, anything from a fraction of a hertz, of a cycle per second, out to about 20 cycles per second, those differences can be tracked by this brainstem nucleus, and they can cause this powerful oscillation that is what is so useful at engendering deep transcendental states of conscious awareness, putting us into that kind of lucid dreaming state. But it's a powerful technique in our modern world of anxiety. There's a peer-reviewed pilot study in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases published by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. I think it was in February of 2020, might have been January, but in 2020, early 2020, Dr. Yusim published her report and found that she had a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms in a busy Manhattan psychiatry practice over 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics versus only a 7% reduction in people who got standard talk therapy over 2 weeks. So just by listening to these tones, people were able to have great relief of anxiety. And I promise you, relief of anxiety is just the beginning of what's going on there. Many people are able to connect with souls of departed loved ones, with spiritual guides. There are many different powerful results that can accrue there. And I would refer people to sacredacoustics.com. There's a page there on testimonials. And you can find big examples there of where people have used this. But in terms of scientific proof of the power these tones have in alleviating anxiety as a starting point, that Anna Yusim paper in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases is a very powerful starting point.
And we will link to this in the description of this video if you're watching this on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're listening to this today. But do you personally pray? And obviously you mentioned that you meditate, but what technique works best for you?
Well, I use sacred acoustics, but I'll also say for me, meditation is always a form of centering prayer. I always am going right into that God mind, into the beautiful, loving, all is well force that I first encountered in my near-death experience. And to me, that knowing in the reality of a deeply loving, omniscient, creative, and yet I would stress co-creative partner, because that God loves us so much as to give us that gift of free will, which allows us to, do things that deviate from the most ideal pathway forward. But that's where a life review is so important. Life review is, as I said, about half of NDEers have them. Because of my amnesia, I could not have an Eben Alexander life review, but I saw life reviews in very large generic fashion in 2 visions I had. One I call the flying fish vision, and then in a later passage through the core realm, the Indra's net vision, this incredible vision of interwoven tapestry, a fabric of all of our interwoven lives, and the very weave of the fabric showed birth and death and rebirth. And so these cycles, all contributing to this golden Christ consciousness at the core of this beautiful tapestry. It was the kind of God consciousness that we're all working towards. And that God consciousness is absolutely one where humanity has gotten to a point of full unconditional love, kindness, compassion, mercy, respect for all fellow beings. And we're headed there. We're headed there through this process of life reviews, kind of refining the way we behave. Basically, the life review is the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the fabric of the universe. For example, Bruce Grayson, who's a skeptical UVA psychiatrist who's written about NDEs for the last 45 or so years, wrote a summary of almost 700 life reviews in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021. And in that report, he mentioned, as I said above, a third of these life reviews involve your whole life, which is because it's in a timeless realm. That's how that can happen. But then about something like half of them described the life review as more real than lived events, and that it was a reliving, not a remembering. So these are not dreams and memories, but an actual reliving of events. Most importantly, 84% of the life reviews in his study said it was from the perspective of everyone involved. The message there is if you're busy handing out pain and suffering to your fellow beings, watch out, because in your life review, you'll be on the receiving end of that because you replace them. That's why it's the perspective of everyone. That's why it's teaching us to hurt another is to hurt ourselves. That's why one of the deepest and most powerful lessons to come out of the near-death experience community is treat others with the love and respect they deserve as eternal spiritual beings. We're all in this together. We're here to take care of each other. The hardships and challenges in life are gifts. They are stepping stones that energize our growth as higher souls. And that's why, accepting and embracing the challenges in life, and especially in life reviews and meditation, what have you, coming to recognize that it's how we respond to those challenges that best dictates our pathway forward. And the more we can focus on the higher good and treating others with love and respect, the more effortless that pathway forward as a soul truly is. And certainly when you come to the end of your physical life, it's a much easier pathway if you've just been lots of goodness and joy and unconditional love to your fellow beings through your whole lifetime makes that life review a piece of cake. As my partner and wife Karen Newell points out, just do a daily review. And I think that makes perfect sense. Don't build up all that baggage. And for God's sake, don't spend the rest of your life as a hardcore materialist, physicalist, and then at the end on your deathbed, realize when your loved ones who have already passed come to welcome you and you know they're really there, oh my God, I thought this was all nonsense. I made a fool of myself my whole life by believing otherwise. In fact, in my second book, The Map of Heaven, we have a bit of a confession by Roger Ebert, who is the famous movie reviewer of Siskel and Ebert. As he came close to his own passage, he recognized that the whole thing was a hoax. This theater of materialism is a joke. It's not real. That there's a much deeper aspect of reality that we're all part of, and it involves love and compassion and kindness for all of our fellow beings. So let's all awaken to that now. The bleak and paltry fiction of materialism is untrue. It's leading us off a cliff, an abyss. All this political polarization, the malignant narcissism in our modern world, a very deadly and toxic combination, especially when you blend that with corporate greed, for example, of the energy industry, continuing to pretend that we're not in the midst of an absolute cataclysm of human-caused climate change. People might close their eyes and pretend they don't see what they're seeing, but the bottom line is the fires, the droughts, the floods, the superstorms, they're going to get worse and worse as we keep burning fossil fuels. And that's due to greed and complicity of scientists who know better. I can show you a paper from 1912 where scientists said if we keep burning wood and coal, ultimately the planet will heat up because of all the carbon dioxide. It'll be too hot to live in. That was in 1912. And the scientists today who are denying human-caused climate change are simply denying the obvious scientific evidence that we're dooming this planet and thousands to millions of species that will go extinct if we don't get our heads together and start becoming proper stewards of the planet now.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And I know I have a million questions, but I know our time is limited and I do respect your time. If someone is watching this that, believes in, most people that are watching, listening to this believe in a lot of this, but still I think it's very common for people to fear death and to fear what will happen. I mean, it's inevitable that everyone's body dies. So what would you tell anyone watching or listening to this that is fearful of death?
I would simply say, if you read Living in Mindful Universe or take that 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness free course on the welcome page at ebenalexander.com, you'll be well on your way to getting how all of this fits together, how there really is nothing to fear about death. Death is part of this beautiful thing we call living. In fact, living is not even possible without death. Death is the end of a material body, but it's not the end of your soul and your soul's awareness, and it's not the end of your soul's connection to fellow loved ones. In many ways, it's kind of an opening of that door that connects us with many of the loved ones who have passed, and a realization that we're still connected with loved ones who are still incarnate, in this consensus reality. So there's nothing to fear about death. Taking of life violates rules at all different levels. So murder and suicide and homicide are pretty direct violations of a lot of how this system is supposed to work. But never forget that ultimately, when a body is dead, that doesn't mean that the soul that inhabited it has come to an end. In fact, just the opposite. It's been liberated from the shackles of the prison. This is why after-death communications, deathbed visions, end-of-life dreams and visions are so important. And for those who complain, I want to know what happens when somebody really dies, not just what happens, to a near-death experiencer who comes back. Go to the work of Christopher Kerr, Kerr. He wrote a great book about 5 or 6 years ago. It's called Death is But a Dream. He's a physician working at Hospice Buffalo. He doesn't care about NDEs at all. All he deals with are people who are dying, and people who are dying in, palliative care and hospice, etc. They tell the same kind of stories as the NDEers. They show the beginnings of life reviews. They are welcomed across the veil by their loved ones who have already passed. I mean, that happened to my own mother, my adoptive mother. In 2019, she was 99 years old. And she, the last 4 or 5 days of her life, she had a pulmonary infection, fever. At that age, that kind of stuff puts you unresponsive. She was unresponsive, but 2 nights before she passed, the nurse told us she woke up, got out of bed, which the nurse said should have been impossible. She said, my mother's here, call my kids right now, she's really here. And then she went back to bed and went into her unconscious state again. By the time we all got there, she was no longer conscious. But the reality is, when I heard she had seen her own mother, I knew that to be a very real encounter, and I better get home. So we got home, and she passed a day later. Terminal lucidity is kind of a generic term for that kind of thing. And I know of many cases of people far worse off than my mother, people who have been comatose for months or years, maybe even never responsive their whole life, and somehow, right before they die, they come back to life, interactive with loved ones, and they pass from this world with a smile on their face. I even tell a story of terminal lucidity in my book, Proof of Heaven. It actually had to do with a friend of mine who was head of one of the top neurosurgical programs on Earth. And that's why he was trained as a materialist too, had trouble understanding what he saw his own father go through when his father passed. And the father actually witnessed the soul of his mother, that would be the grandmother of my friend, at the foot of the bed. Now, my friend couldn't see her, but he was absolutely convinced that his father did. And he had no idea how to make sense of it. The father had been with the mother, that grandmother, during the Holocaust. She had passed when he was like 14 years old. He'd never talked about her because of that. But now on his deathbed, he'd been unresponsive for weeks, but now he woke back up and was interactive with the soul of his mother at the bedside, and died with a smile on his face. So these are all examples of the big reality about death. And so when we cover these in books like Living the Mindful Universe, and there are many other books. If you go to ebenalexander.com, there's a recommended reading web page, a lot of hot links to scientific papers. They're all categorized. Many books there that have been important to me are listed in that reading list. So there are a lot of resources there. Also on ebenalexander.com, I recommend the FAQ page. That's for a lot of questions, especially questions often brought up by the lay press. There have been like 1 or 2 people who tried to attack my story, and then their stories have been carried on trying to, hurt my reputation, things like that. And the answers are all there in that FAQ page to help people get up to speed to the truth of these stories and encounters.
And we definitely will link to that in the show notes if you're listening to this, or in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. We are here with Dr. Eben Alexander. And so your website is the best place for people to find your books and your material?
Yes, absolutely. The ebenalexander.com. I've mentioned the recommended reading list there, and the FAQ page. There are also many links to interviews I've given, conferences, things like that, audio and video interviews. There's a tremendous amount of information there. And also, I'd highly recommend people go, if you want to learn more about differential frequency brainwave entrainment and how you can help get you in a deep meditative state, go to sacredacoustics.com. That's Karen Newell, my wife's webpage. She's also the co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe. But people can find a lot of information there. She has a page, I want to ... I want to do this or that, whatever spiritual goal you might have, or just kind of relief of anxiety, whatever have you. Go to sacredacoustics.com, find that page, and you'll quickly see that there are specific recommendations of the sound files you can listen to help you get to that goal.
Amazing. Well, I'm definitely going to check that out myself.
Excellent.
Yes. Dr. Eben Alexander, is there anything else you want to say today that I don't know enough to ask, or that you just want to say today?
Well, I think the important thing for people to get is this is, a revolution with no soul left behind. Anyone out there who senses, that they're more than just a physical body of chemical reactions, a meat robot, but they suspect they have higher meaning and purpose in this world, the answer is yes. And it has to do with identifying with your soul and seeing your soul's connection with the mind of the universe, that we share meaning and purpose with each other and with that God mind of the universe. Get into meditation, centering prayer, start living every day by making these choices to show compassion, kindness, and mercy for all fellow beings. There are ways you can join this revolution. And of course, it's not just about meditating your way to these deeper truths, but then starting to live that truth in how you lived this life. And I think all of us can agree that contributing to the higher good ends up making us feel a lot better about life anyway. And if it's aligned with meaning and purpose of the universe at large, it becomes more and more powerful as a way to express our vision of ideals and the way this universe should be. We can bring all of that into fruition through acknowledging the power of mind over matter, which goes far beyond just placebo effect, spontaneous remission, and miraculous healing in near-death experiences, to all of us being able to manifest the world of our dreams.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Is there anything else that you want to say on camera here?
I think that about does it. And I just, blessings to you and your audience. And they can reach out to us through ebenalexander.com and sacredacoustics.com. And I just encourage people to join the revolution. This is all about freeing up the human spirit and taking care of all of our fellow beings.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. It was very inspiring, very enlightening. And I will definitely personally check out your websites as well. So thank you so much. We will link to those below.
All right. Thank you very much for having me on. And thanks for doing what you do.
It's pick the right three numbers between 0 and 9. We've done it several times, but we won twice. The consciousness, we found out, is so powerful. It's like it can see potential futures. Some people have dreams where they see the actual numbers and they go and buy a ticket with those numbers and they win. And in that case, is it clairvoyance? Are they just seeing the future? Or is it telepathy? What if, when some people have won the lottery and they've picked the right numbers, they're receiving that information from their future self, who's the winner?